When I first met Mark, my husband, it felt like fate had finally handed me my perfect match. He was everything I thought I wanted, kind, attentive, and charming, in ways that made my heart race. We got married within a year of knowing each other, and those early days were like something out of a dream. I'd catch myself smiling at the smallest things he did, whether it was the way he brewed my coffee just right, or how he always pulled me into his arms at the end of a long day. It was the kind of love that felt too good to ever fade. But 5 years in, the magic wasn't the same. It wasn't that Mark had changed. Exactly, he still cared in his quiet way. But the fire between us had dimmed. We were more like roommates sharing a life than lovers sharing a future. Before diving deeper into this gripping story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Now, let's continue unraveling the twists and turns. To complicate matters, Mark's son, Ethan, from his first marriage, had come to live with us while finishing his studies. Ethan was in his early 20s, polite but reserved, and he carried himself with a guarded demeanor that made him hard to read. I tried to connect with him at first, inviting him into conversations and asking about his interests. But his answers were always short, his smile fleeting. It was like there was an invisible wall between us, one I couldn't figure out how to break through. Despite this distance, I couldn't help but feel a strange emotional undercurrent whenever he was around. At first, I chalked it up to the natural awkwardness of blending families, but it lingered in a way I couldn't ignore. I noticed how his gaze would linger on me just a beat longer than seemed casual, or how his presence filled the house with a quiet tension I couldn't quite name. It wasn't until I started catching glimpses of something deeper, his vulnerability, the way he carried himself as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders, that I began to feel something shift. Emotion surged within me unexpectedly, catching me off guard. It wasn't just the disconnection I felt with Mark that was gnawing at me. It was the way Ethan's quiet intensity made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. The contrast was overwhelming. Mark, my steady, dependable husband, seemed oblivious to the emotional void growing between us, while Ethan, with his careful glances and measured words, seemed to cut straight to the heart of my loneliness. It was a confusing, tumultuous feeling. Guilt, longing, and something dangerously close to excitement all rolled into one. I tried to dismiss it, to bury it deep, but the more I tried, the stronger it became. Ethan wasn't just a young man trying to find his way. He was becoming the mirror that reflected back everything I was missing. And every time our paths crossed, the emotions within me surged, threatening to overflow. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting feeling born of loneliness. But deep down, I knew it was the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. It started small, almost imperceptibly, a shift so subtle I could have missed it. Ethan, my stepson, was always polite but distant, keeping a quiet wall between us that I'd long accepted as his way of coping with our blended family. For years, I'd tried to connect with him, to bring him into the fold, but it always felt forced. His answers were clipped, his smiles fleeting, and his presence more like a shadow than a part of the household. But something changed one day, and the change wasn't something I could ignore. I began noticing moments that left me feeling unsettled, moments that made me question if I was imagining things. A lingering glance from Ethan as I walked into the kitchen. A smile that felt a shade too warm. A compliment. "That dress really suits you," delivered with a softness that made my heart skip a beat. At first, I convinced myself it was all innocent, the overthinking of someone desperate for attention. But the way he looked at me, the way his gaze seemed to linger like a secret, began to stir something inside me that I couldn't control. It was a quiet afternoon when everything shifted. I was folding laundry in the living room, while Mark, my husband, was at work. Ethan walked in fresh from a workout, his tank top clinging to his skin, a faint sheen of sweat catching the light. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice casual but his smile disarming. I laughed, trying to mask the sudden rush of warmth I felt. "Since when do you volunteer for chores?" I teased, hoping my voice sounded steady. As he sat beside me, the space between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. For the first time, we talked not the surface-level small talk we'd exchanged before, but real conversation. He told me about school, his plans, his childhood, and as he spoke, I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. His laughter filled the room, and his words felt like they were meant for me alone. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "You're really easy to talk to. I don't feel that way about many people." I froze. My cheeks flushed as I pretended to focus on a towel, but his words echoed in my mind, sending ripples through the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. The way he looked at me wasn't just friendly or polite, it was something more, something I couldn't name, but could feel deep in my chest. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. After that day, the air between us changed irrevocably. Every glance, every passing touch felt magnified. I started noticing the way his presence filled a room, how his gaze seemed to pierce through me, seeing things I didn't even want to admit to myself. It was like he'd opened a door I couldn't close, and every step we took felt like we were inching closer to a line I wasn't sure I'd be able to come back from. Each interaction with Ethan left me breathless, my emotions swirling in a confusing mix of guilt, longing, and exhilaration. The boundaries were shifting, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the tension between us was undeniable. I wasn't just imagining it anymore. Something had awakened, and it was pulling me toward him with a force I couldn't fight. The moment everything truly crossed the line remains etched in my mind, a quiet, unassuming night that turned into something I could never undo. It had started innocently enough, as these things often do. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a photo album from years ago, lost in nostalgia. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. I didn't even hear Ethan come in until he was suddenly there, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I glanced up, startled, then gestured to the album in my lap. "Old memories," I said with a laugh, hoping to keep things light. But when he sat down beside me, his closeness made my breath hitch, and I felt the now familiar tension rise between us. As I flipped the page, his eyes lingered on a picture of me from my 20s. "Is that you?" he asked, his tone filled with something I couldn't place. "It is," I replied, laughing nervously. "Back when butterfly clips and crop tops were a thing." He smiled, but there was no teasing in his expression, just quiet intensity. "You're beautiful," he said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. My cheeks burned, my pulse quickened, and I looked away, trying to act unaffected. "Ethan, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" he countered, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Why can't I tell you how I feel?" My heart pounded as his words hung in the air. I wanted to shut it down, to tell him this was wrong, that it could never happen. But instead, I found myself frozen, unable to look at him, yet unable to pull away. The truth was, I didn't know how to respond. His gaze felt like it was unraveling something inside me, something I'd been too scared to face. From that moment, the line between us began to blur. The small touches, the lingering glances, they all carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. Every time we crossed paths, it felt like the air around us thickened, like we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us fully understood, but both of us were drawn to. One evening, Mark went to bed early, leaving me and Ethan alone in the quiet house. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up, hoping to avoid him, but he found me anyway. His voice was soft but insistent. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes searching mine. I shook my head, trying to avoid the conversation I knew would come. "There's nothing to talk about," I whispered, though my voice trembled with the weight of the lie. "There is," he said, stepping closer. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." The intensity in his voice made my chest tighten. I wanted to scream, to run, to deny everything. But deep down, I couldn't deny the pull between us, even as guilt and fear clawed at the edges of my mind. It was no longer just a fleeting connection. It was something alive, something neither of us could control, no matter how hard we tried. The days that followed our stolen kiss were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, yet there was no denying the change that had taken place between Ethan and me. It was as if a door had been flung open, exposing feelings I had tried so hard to ignore. I couldn't look at him without my heart racing, couldn't be near him without feeling the electricity crackling in the air between us. And yet, the guilt hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive, reminding me with every breath that this was wrong. Mark, my husband, was completely oblivious to the tension that now ruled the house. He went about his routine, engrossed in work, and barely noticing the growing silence between us. It only made things worse, deepening the chasm that had formed in our marriage. I resented him for not seeing what was happening, for not noticing the woman I was becoming in his absence. And Ethan noticed everything. It was impossible to ignore the way Ethan lingered, always finding reasons to be near me. Whether it was brushing past me in the kitchen or sitting just a little too close on the couch, every interaction felt like it was loaded with unspoken words. I told myself to put distance between us, but it was like trying to resist gravity. The pull was too strong, and I was too weak to fight it. One quiet afternoon, I sat in the backyard watering the plants, hoping to find a moment of peace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and for a brief moment, I let myself forget everything. But then Ethan appeared, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I laughed nervously, trying to mask the unease his presence always seemed to stir. "You always seem to show up when I'm doing chores," I said, handing him the watering can. He took it without hesitation, his fingers brushing against mine a touch so fleeting, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. "Maybe I just like the company," he replied, his words laced with meaning. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. He wasn't just saying words, he was revealing something deeper, something raw and unfiltered. "You deserve to be seen," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "To be appreciated for who you are." The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over the fragile defenses I'd tried so hard to build. My heart ached with the truth of them, with the longing I'd been denying for so long. But even as my chest tightened with emotion, I forced myself to look away. "Ethan, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his voice unwavering. "It's the truth." I wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away and leave me to the life I'd built, no matter how empty it felt. But the truth was, his words had ignited something in me, a spark that refused to die. And as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me didn't want him to stop. As the days went by, the weight of what had happened between Ethan and me became impossible to ignore. I was living a double life, one where I pretended to be the devoted wife to Mark, and another where I was caught in an emotional storm I couldn't escape. Every glance, every brush of Ethan's hand against mine felt like fuel added to a fire I was desperate to put out, but couldn't help being drawn to. The guilt was suffocating, yet beneath it was something I couldn't deny. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Mark's oblivion only made things worse. He'd come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and bury himself in his laptop or the TV. The disconnect between us felt like an ever-widening canyon, and I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at me the way Ethan did. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Mark wasn't cruel or neglectful. He was simply absent. And Ethan? He was always present, always watching, always there when I needed to feel like I mattered. One evening, Mark went out with friends, leaving the house unusually quiet. I tried to keep myself busy, folding laundry and tidying up, but the stillness only amplified the noise in my head. I told myself I'd avoid Ethan, stay in the bedroom, and keep the distance I so desperately needed. But when I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, there he was, sitting at the dining table with his laptop. Oh, I said, startled. I didn't think anyone was still up. Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my heart race. Couldn't sleep, he said simply, closing his laptop and leaning back in his chair. His presence filled the room, making it feel smaller, more intimate, and I hesitated before turning to leave. You okay? He asked, his voice soft but laced with something that felt dangerously close to concern. I turned back, unsure of what to say. I'm fine, I lied. Though the tremor in my voice betrayed me, he tilted his head slightly, studying me as though he could see right through the facade I was trying so hard to maintain. You don't seem fine, he said, his tone gentle but insistent. Is everything okay? With you and Dad? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. What was I supposed to say? That everything between Mark and me felt like it was crumbling, and I was drowning in emotions I couldn't control. That Ethan's attention, his care, his presence, had become the lifeline I didn't want to admit I needed. I don't know, I finally whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know what's going on anymore. Ethan stood then, his movements slow and deliberate, and stepped closer. The intensity in his eyes made my pulse quicken, and I knew we were standing on the edge of something that could destroy everything. The kiss lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. No matter how hard I tried to bury it, the memory resurfaced, bringing with it a wave of emotions so overwhelming I could barely think straight. The days following that moment with Ethan were a blur of guilt, confusion, and an aching need I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself it had been a mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. It hadn't felt fleeting. It had felt monumental, like something I couldn't take back no matter how much I wanted to. Mark, oblivious as always, went about his usual routine, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath our roof. He worked late, came home, and barely spoke beyond the occasional polite comment. His detachment only fueled my growing resentment. How could he not see me? How could he not notice the woman standing right in front of him, desperate for even a sliver of his attention? And yet, Ethan noticed everything. He always did. Ethan's presence became inescapable. It wasn't that he followed me or sought me out explicitly. It was the way he seemed to appear in the quiet moments when I least expected it. I'd find him in the kitchen late at night, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken, or he'd sit next to me on the couch, his arm brushing against mine in a way that felt both accidental and deliberate. Each interaction was charged with something unspoken, something that made my heart race and my stomach twist. One evening, after Mark had gone to bed early, I found myself in the living room, pretending to read a book I couldn't focus on. Ethan walked in, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the other end of the couch. The silence between us was heavy, thick with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I glanced at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Talk about what?" I said, though I knew exactly what he meant. "You know what?" he replied, his gaze unwavering. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Ethan, this has to stop," I whispered, though the words sounded hollow even to me. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" he challenged, leaning forward slightly. "Because it didn't feel like one." His words hit me like a blow, knocking down the fragile defenses I'd built around myself. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. I couldn't deny the way he made me feel, the way his attention filled the void Mark had left behind. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "It's wrong." "But it's real," he countered, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "And you know it." The room felt unbearably small, the air too thick to breathe. I stood abruptly, desperate to create distance between us, but my heart ached as I did. I wanted to walk away, to put an end to whatever this was. but a part of me, the part that had felt so invisible for so long, wanted to stay. As the weight of my emotions grew heavier, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Every day felt like a balancing act, one where I was constantly teetering on the edge of discovery, guilt, and longing. The house became a minefield of tension, Mark going about his routines, blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing under his roof, and Ethan's presence an unrelenting reminder of everything I was trying to suppress. It was suffocating, yet somehow, I couldn't bring myself to escape. Mark was so predictable, so steady in his patterns, that it almost felt cruel. He'd kiss me on the cheek in the mornings, ask me what I wanted for dinner, and then retreat into his work, as if that was all marriage required. I resented his ease, his complacency, and the way he'd stopped looking at me as if I mattered. Meanwhile, Ethan Young, earnest Ethan, looked at me like I was the center of his world, and in those moments when his eyes met mine, the guilt and excitement twisted together in a way that left me breathless. One night, Mark fell asleep early after a long day at work, and I found myself in the kitchen cleaning up, trying to busy my hands to keep my mind from wandering. I heard the soft creak of footsteps and looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the frame, watching me. His gaze was calm, but beneath it was a storm I could feel pulling me in. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I hesitated, clutching the dish rag in my hands like it was a lifeline. "Ethan, we don't need to do this," I said, though my voice trembled under the weight of the truth. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he said, stepping further into the room. His presence filled the space, making it feel smaller, more intimate. "You know we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." His words hung in the air, and I felt the walls I'd so carefully built begin to crumble. I turned away, trying to focus on the sink, the dishes, anything but him. "Ethan, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This isn't right." "But it's real," he said, his tone steady and insistent. "And you know it is." Tears pricked my eyes as I gripped the edge of the counter, my mind racing. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I couldn't. Because it was real. It was too real, and it terrified me. I turned to face him, my emotions written all over my face. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I want you to stop hiding," he said softly, stepping closer. "I want you to see me, to see what's right here." His words hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and inescapable. I wanted to push him away, to tell him this had to end, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I could, or if I even wanted to. This story is a stark reminder of the fragile boundaries in relationships and the complexities of human emotions. It highlights the importance of communication, trust, and emotional connection in maintaining a marriage. Neglecting these aspects can create voids, leaving room for temptation and missteps that can alter lives forever. The tale urges us to confront our feelings honestly and address the cracks in our relationships before they widen. Ultimately, it's a lesson in self-awareness, choices, and the profound impact our actions have, not only on ourselves, but on those we care about most.